we'll get started. So we are number 4. So this lecture will, in many ways, serve as our kind of bridge to the final lecture this time next week, okay, where hopefully the achievement that Nietzsche sees in the tragic theatre of Sophocles and Aeschylus will become clear to us. But as I said at the beginning, I've tried to go quite slowly, layering in material as we've gone along, so that hopefully by the time we get to this time next week, we have a reasonable grip on the finished product. Okay, all right. So let us briefly recapitulate. So welcome back. Now, what we can do now, given the labor of the last few weeks, is begin to articulate what Nietzsche sees in what he calls Apollonian culture. So the pre-tragic culture of the ancient Greeks, of his favored period. So to get to this point, we've passed through, as you know, an overview of Schopenhauer's metaphysical vision. We've seen both where he is and where he's not close to Schopenhauer, where he, if you like, gets in his own way, as he comes to see, I think quite quickly, but certainly as he writes back, looking back on his work in 1886. We've seen one of the most significant differences between Nietzsche and Schopenhauer in terms of their vision of kind of the fundamental reality, or the Einer, the primordial unity, is that for Nietzsche, this primordial unity is fundamentally artistic, as well as being internally self-contradictory. And it's self-contradictory because while it suffers eternally, it also seeks eternally to balance its pain with the pleasure it takes in the generation of the empirical world. We've seen too that the Scheinungen, or the semblances that are eternally created by the activity of the will, are actually really and truly individuated items, unlike, of course, Schopenhauer's vision, where that reality at some depth, some ontological depth, disappears. And of course, these items of the empirical world include we ourselves. Nonetheless, for Nietzsche, even though these items of the empirical world are really real, they're not the deepest, fullest form of reality, which of course can only ever be for Nietzsche the Einer. And finally, last week we saw how the empirical world for Nietzsche is generated continually by the primordial unity, by way of the two primal artistic drives, which he labels the Apollonian and the Dionysian, of course. And we also saw last week in particular how, from a certain phenomenological point of view, all semblances, all empirical items of the world, the Scheinungen, can be appreciated and understood as shine, as a kind of Apollonian clarity and surface that implies continually a Dionysian abyss. Now, to get to next week, the summit phenomenon of ancient Greek tragic theatre, what we have to do this week is first of all examine the nature of Apollonian culture. Then we need to move to the Dionysian revelry that actually fractures and disturbs that Apollonian achievement. And finally, we can move to a truly remarkable passage in The Birth of Tragedy, where Nietzsche looks to the ancient poet Archilochus to describe what he understands to be the emergence of the Dionysian lyric poet. And it's in the Dionysian lyric poet, particularly in the figure of Archilochus, that Nietzsche will see the seed, or the germ, as he calls it, of the later dithyramb and tragic theatre itself, particularly the chorus of satyrs, all of which we will look at next week. All right. So I'm going to move at a reasonable clip because we're a little bit late. So to make headway with what we have to do today, we have to circle back around to the theme, one of the themes that we began with, which is pessimism. So you will recall that when Nietzsche publishes his attempt at self-criticism, when he produces the second edition of The Birth of Tragedy, he subtitles it Hellenism and Pessimism. Okay, so pessimism is a fundamental aspect of the work. And now we can kind of take a second run at this idea of pessimism. We have to remind ourselves, first of all, of the type of pessimism that Nietzsche is actually concerned with. So as we'll, hopefully you will recall, this is fundamentally the pessimism of strength, as he calls it. Now, in Nietzsche's view, it's this strong type of pessimism that the Greeks of his favorite period supposedly possessed. Now, this pessimism was a point of view in existence that felt the problem of existence in a particular way, that approached the problem of life and therefore understood it in a particular manner. It came at the problem of life from a particularly vibrant sensitivity to life. It came at life from a position of courage, from abundance of existence, Nietzsche thinks. And this approach found in the negative aspects of existence that against which it could test its strength. So, rich, full life for Nietzsche wants to feel its richness and fullness. Strength wants to exercise itself. Courage wants to feel fear in order to overcome it. Curiosity wants to know more and more. Feelings of worship and adoration wish to worship and adore. Feelings of height, of native supremacy and power want to feel and see themselves confirmed through victory and so on. So, in the thickets of the problem of existence that these Greeks saw and felt, they discovered all of these things, including an endlessly enticing vista of investigation, within which they could pursue their intense desire to know the truth of existence. Now, in section 8 of The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche says that the Greeks wanted the truth of existence in all its power, to know it and to feel it. They wanted to approach life intellectually and as well, and as the visceral opponent that life so often is. And they did so out of their abundance of vivacity. So it's this pessimism of strength, therefore, this craving to know and struggle with the problem of life out of a great glowing abundance of life that the Greeks bring sharply into focus. The Greeks thereby bring sharply into focus the problem of knowledge for human existence. So, in The Birth of Tragedy, the problem of pessimism rather famously appears in a particular form. And Nietzsche calls this a piece of popular Greek wisdom. It's the story of Midas. Midas has a relentless and a restless desire to know what is best and most excellent for human beings. And to that end, he pursues the companion of Dionysus, Silenus. There he is with his dad bod. Look at that. He pursues him continually and eventually captures him. And he forces him to speak. And eventually, Silenus laughs, which should have given everyone pause, but nevertheless, you can see there, wretched ephemeral race, children of trance and tribulation, why do you force me to tell you the very thing it would be most profitable for you not to hear? The very best thing is utterly beyond your reach, namely not to have been born, not to be nothing. However, the second best thing for you is to die as quickly as you can. Not great at parties, obviously. Now, this terrible announcement reveals knowledge, particularly knowledge of the nature of existence, as a problem for existence. Knowledge is a problem. We should also note that Silenus does not willingly give up what Midas catastrophically wants him to tell him. As a companion of Dionysus, as a companion, therefore, of the great Aina in its seething superabundance, presumably Silenus is privy to some of the secrets of the abyss, but nature does not willingly reveal herself. And what secrets are wrested from her often do not bring us much by way of comfort. So, in fact, in what would turn out to be essentially an early draft of a portion of The Birth of Tragedy, namely the text in the Birth of Tragic Thought, Nietzsche actually portrays this moment with Midas and Silenus in a different way, and has Silenus explicitly tortured by Midas, and Silenus, rather than laughing at Midas, sneers at him with contempt. It's interesting, actually. I shall come back to this at the end of the lecture today, but all through Nietzsche's work, but particularly in The Birth of Tragedy, we have a very clear sense that there's a certain deprioritization of the human going on. The contempt or the mocking laughter of Silenus is a clue. We are not the ground of our being in The Birth of Tragedy. We are not the agents of our own destiny that we might think ourselves to be, in Nietzsche's view. And as we'll see at the end, when it comes to the Dionysian lyric artist, we can see that we are, in fact, playthings of the will. And at best, if we are artists, we are working in imitatio Dei. Okay. In any case, the insight that lies at the heart of The Birth of Tragedy is a catastrophic one. That insight is a point of view on existence that views views it as a point of mourning, as a catastrophe that we exist at all, that we survived birth. Now, these points of view, such a point of view, can be worked up in an intellectual way as a kind of anti-natalism. More often, it's not worked up in such a way and is played out as a kind of corrosive, potentially highly destructive, either of self or others or both, kind of pessimism come, to use the term loosely, nihilism. So this is not an insignificant point of view. It's not an insignificant, if you like, phenomenological, affective, existential stance. This is something highly dangerous. This is volatile material, if you like. Nonetheless, it's necessary, if and as far as we can, to dwell on the pain of this insight, to try and feel out its consequences as fully as we might be able to, because it helps us to understand what Nietzsche is talking about when he looks at the achievement of Apollonian culture. Out of vivacity and exuberant courage, the Greeks uncovered something horrific. Their strength brought them perhaps the strongest and most challenging of all pessimisms, one that sees an immediate suicide as a blessed relief from the misery of being alive. Now, attempting to think this through, even cognitively, is difficult, and with a greater bandwidth of ourselves, it's painful, because it undercuts all the joy and purpose and meaning in life, save for the overwhelming presence of the negative and the temptation or the looming task of doing away with ourselves. But this is the insight, this agonizing point of view on existence, that it is better not to be, and to not be as quickly as we possibly can. That is actually the foundation upon which the artful edifice, as he says, of beautiful Apollonian culture rests. This shining glory of Apollonian culture rests on Silenic insight, and therefore catastrophic horror, pessimism, and the temptation to self-destruction. So, how does this come about? How does this world of the Olympian gods, as Nietzsche says, relate to this piece of popular wisdom, to this Silenic wisdom? And he comes up with a very particular response. He says, the relationship is that of the ecstatic vision of a tortured martyr to his torments. Now we have to try and understand what that means. Okay. So the relationship between the world of the Olympian gods, resplendent, celebrated, the relationship between that and Silenic insight is one of an ecstatic vision of a tortured martyr. What does that mean? Well, we can maybe think it through in an initial way, a very inadequate way. We can say that we have perhaps three elements. We have the tortured martyr. We have the martyr's vision of his torments. And we have the ecstasy felt in beholding that vision. We can also suggest something like this. A figure is tortured and he suffers. Yet in the midst of this torture, he calls for a mirror to be placed before him as he is tortured. Now, as he watches the reflection of his own agony, he experiences an ecstasy. Why? Well, something must have occurred in the mirror or through the mirror. Some kind of transfiguration of the martyr's torments, perhaps. So, these Greeks, these figures Nietzsche sees who were so powerful, so exquisitely sensitive to both the positive and the negative aspects of existence, because they were so attuned, they were so open, they were so clean in their nervous systems, they inevitably suffered, and they suffered continually. They, as Nietzsche says, knew and felt the terrors and horrors of existence, and they were vulnerable precisely because of their strength. I said, I think possibly in the first or the second lecture, that for Nietzsche, in many ways, the strong are the most vulnerable. Their conditions of life are multiple, they are particularly vulnerable to adverse conditions, and their strength also drives them to conduct that can expose them to despair, for example. Now, Nietzsche's whole point about bringing up the wisdom of Silenus, of course, is to explain how the Greeks overcame the pessimism that flowed from that insight. And they overcame it by way of a transfiguration. And this transfiguration was produced and experienced according to the influence of the Apollonian artistic drive, hence the production eventually of Apollonian culture. Now, theirs was an artistic response, note, to the problem of existence. This fact immediately discloses their native health in Nietzsche's eyes. They had an attunement to a relationship to these native artistic drives of existence in a way that later generations of humans, in Nietzsche's view, have not had in quite the same way. Now, those of us with even a basic familiarity with the kind of pantheon of Greek gods may be slightly confused at Nietzsche's assertion that what the Greeks managed to erect was Apollonian culture, because, well, isn't it supposed to be Zeus who's the head of the gods? You see here a kind of frieze, one depiction of the Olympic pantheon. Now you can see Apollo there on the far end. Apollo is there, but for Nietzsche, it's not Zeus who ought to be the kind of characterizing, defining figure. It's Apollo, and you can see the quotation there. Nietzsche says, "The first things we observe here are the magnificent figures of the Olympian gods who stand on the gables of this building." You see that quite literally here. "And whose deeds, represented in reliefs, which can be seen gleaming from afar, adorn its friezes. Now, if Apollo is amongst their number as just one god alongside others and without laying claim to the leading position, we shouldn't allow this fact to confuse us." Whether we agree with this or not is up to you, but this is Nietzsche's position. He says the very same drive, the Apollonian drive, which assumed sensuous form in Apollo, gave birth to the entire Olympian world. And in this sense, we are entitled to regard Apollo as its father. So we'll remember that the Apollonian drive produces form, clarity, order, measure, restraint. It allows comprehensibility, explicability, and so forth. Okay. Now, whether we find this convincing or not, this is Nietzsche's position, namely that it is, even though Apollo is one god among the rest, it is the underlying Apollonian drive working through the Greek people that produces, as a remarkable response, an overcoming of the pessimism of Silenic insight, eventually produces the majestic side of Apollonian culture. Okay. So he says, quote, "In order to live at all, that is to avoid suicide through that insight into the nature of existence, the Greeks placed in front of these things the resplendent dream-born figures of the Olympians. You might think of the martyr placing the mirror in front of him. They overcame despair, he says, by means of the artistic middle world of the Olympians. It was under the influence of the Apollonian instinct for beauty that the Olympian divine order of joy developed. Okay. So we have a people whose native health and strength and courage and so on gave them a point of view on existence that made the problem of existence appear to them as a delicious lure to test strength, to slake the desire to know, and so on. But what they know risks destroying them. Their response for Nietzsche demonstrates their nature as strong and courageous. Their response, of course, is not to enact the wisdom of Silenus or the promptings of Silenus, but to overcome it, and to overcome it in a particular manner using the Apollonian artistic drive. But we still need a basic working understanding of how this transfiguration of terror and despair into Apollonian beauty took place. Now, happily, Nietzsche addresses this process at least to some extent. So, in The Birth of Tragedy, section 4, Nietzsche uses Raphael's painting, The Transfiguration, which depicts the transfiguration of Christ, to illustrate, he thinks, the nature of an Apollonian transfiguration. And therefore, at least in a certain sense, in a certain basic sense, all transfiguration, insofar as all transfiguration is some kind of strong, positive, phenomenological alteration in one's experience of existence. Okay, now we'll see in a minute how we should deal with this painting. It's actually quite rare, apparently, to see what's depicted in this painting in one painting. So for those of you who are familiar with the Christian synoptic gospels, we have the top, we have the transfiguration of Christ. So you want to see Matthew chapter 17, 1-7, Mark 9, 2-8, Luke 9, 28-36. That's where you need to go. So, but then at the bottom of the picture is actually the event that in all three of the synoptic gospels occurs immediately after the descent from the mountain after the transfiguration, namely the drama of the possession of the young boy by a demon and the inability of the apostles there to cast out the demon until Christ comes along to do it for them. So that's what's being depicted there. At the top, the transfiguration; at the bottom, the agony of the boy and the helplessness of the adults, right? Seeing those things together in one image is actually quite unusual. Anyway, we'll see why it's important in a moment. So the more one becomes aware of the existence of the two artistic drives of nature, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, these all-powerful artistic drives, and particularly that fervent longing in them for semblance, right? That burning quasi-sexual craving for release in semblances, in shine, the more, Nietzsche thinks, one is attuned to the fact that that which truly exists, namely the eine, that which fully and most richly exists, continually needs the ecstatic vision, namely intensely pleasurable semblance. So, of course, at the back here, we have this claim that Apollonian culture can be likened to the ecstatic vision of the tortured martyr to his torments. Okay? So, going back here, the eine, the primal ground, takes, as we've already seen, tremendous and continual pleasure, enormous pleasure, in the vision of what it creates, in the semblances that it generates, the empirical world. So this empirical world, of course, including ourselves, is generated continually. Thus, Nietzsche thinks the more we are aware of the metaphysical nature of reality, the more our everyday empirical reality will feel as that which truly is not. Now, this is, again, we're separating Nietzsche from Schopenhauer. This is not to say that our existence for Nietzsche is an illusion. It's real, but it's not the deepest and fullest level of reality. So we know this. Okay. So, we've seen for Nietzsche that in dreams, in psychic images, the Einer experiences a meta level of exaltation, right? So, why is it a meta level? Well, because there's a pleasure taken in the production of us. And then when we dream, when we imagine, when we form images, psychic images in our mind, there is a further individuation, which is a further exaltation, kind of rippling and echoing through us, coming up from the Einer. Okay. So dream, and by extension, all Apollonian images, are the, quote, semblance of the semblance, right? So we are one level of semblance, and then when we dream, that's the semblance of the semblance, right? There's a kind of meta level echoing up, if you like. Echoing is probably the wrong word. In fact, it probably is the right word, the wrong word, but hopefully you know what I mean. So there's a yet higher satisfaction taken by the primal ground when we dream, or when we have any other psychic imagining. So he says that the innermost core of nature takes indescribable pleasure in the naive artist and the naive work of art, which is also only the semblance of a semblance. So the work of art itself is, of course, a semblance fashioned by a semblance, right? So in the fashioning of the work of art, the primal ground exalts. Okay. Nietzsche then says, Raphael, one of these immortal naive artists, has depicted for us in a symbolic painting the reduction, interesting word, de potentierum, of semblance to semblance, the primal process of the naive artist and also of Apollonian culture. So what Nietzsche thinks is what's going on here is, if you like, you can read this as a depiction of how Apollonian culture comes to be. This idea of reduction of semblance to semblance is a strange one. I don't think we should be distracted by it particularly. The fundamental point here is that we are moving to another level. So we as semblances create other semblances, either psychically and then on canvas. And there's a kind of movement away from the primal ground, which is accompanied by an exaltation. All right, now, what do we have to do with this painting to understand it? Firstly, we have to divide it in two. Okay, so two parts of the painting. Okay, so number one, the story of the possessed boy. All right, number two, of course, Transfiguration of Christ. Now, what does Nietzsche say about this? Part one, you'll notice how dark it is, how everyone is confused and useless, and how the boy is actually looks quite horrific, right? This is Silenic insight. Part one, a reflection of the eternal primal pain, he says, the only ground of the world. Here, semblance of the eternal contradiction, the father of all things. This is what Nietzsche says. Now, the painting itself is a semblance of a semblance. Okay. In terms of what the painting depicts, part one is a depiction of the primal ground and its eternal suffering contradiction. So what he wants us to feel with this bottom half of the painting is all of the agony and torture and misery that would tip anyone, should you suffer it long enough, into suicidal despair, right? And so it's perhaps fitting that it's the agony of a child that is, if you like, the catalyst for this helplessness of the adults. Right? So anyone that has kids would understand this, and even anyone that doesn't. But this is not just the agony of a child, this is the unassuaged, uncurable agony of a child, okay, which comes, is worked out in darkness with no one knowing what to do. Remember, when Christ comes back down the mountain and encounters this group, they are in panic almost. They can't do it. They can't cast out the demon. What do? Eventually, Jesus has to step in. Okay. Part 2 is then, for Nietzsche, a representation of the eternal consequence of the suffering of the primal ground. Remember, the primal ground is agonized. It responds to that creatively by fashioning something. Note the parallel. The Greeks were agonized through Silenic insight. They responded to it creatively, right? He says, from this semblance, i.e. from the symbolic depiction of the Einer's pain, there now rises like some ambrosian perfume, a vision like new world of semblance, shine, of which those who are trapped in the first semblance see nothing. A luminous hovering in purest bliss and in wide-eyed contemplation free of all pain. Now, I won't dwell on it because we don't have the time, but you can see in that last sentence, or the last few words of that quotation there, with notions of contemplation and so on, there's still kind of Schopenhauerianisms lingering here. And if you actually look at that section overall, and particularly the section on Archilochus as well, he's both is and is not tracking Schopenhauer to some extent in certain ways. But we know all this anyway. So we have here the agonized insight and the transfiguration. All right. So he then says we can see this painting according to 2 levels. The artwork symbolizes, quote, that Apollonian world of beauty, he says, and the ground on which it rests, the terrible wisdom of Silenus. And he says that we should intuitively grasp the reciprocal necessity of these 2 things. Okay? So if you like this, one of the achievements of this painting is to, as a rendering of the agony, present the agony in the rendering itself. Okay? Secondly, he says, in terms of the painting itself, i.e. as the handiwork of an artist, he says we encounter Apollo as the deification of, and here comes the Schopenhauerianism again, the principium individuationis, in which alone the Einer finds relief. All right. Now, here, again, there's a little whisper, little clue, which actually is much stronger when you actually read the text, that really what's at issue here is not human beings. We're just channels and tools. The lesson here, he says, the whole world of agony is needed in order to compel the individual, here the artist, Raphael, to generate the releasing and redemptive vision. Now remember, for the Einer, the constantly, eternally agonized primal ground, the joy, the release from pain, the attempt to balance his agony with joy comes not only through the creation of the empirical world, of all of us and everything else, but through what we can be compelled to produce ourselves So there is a like a meta level pleasure when we dream. There's also a meta level pleasure, perhaps a more worked out, more rich and variegated pleasure when we fabricate, when we create. That again is of course an individuation, a shine. So the human artist is used by the primal ground. We'll come back to that. So it's important now to know the following. So in response to Hellenic wisdom, the insight into the horror of existence, the Greek will, Nietzsche says, held up a transfiguring mirror to itself. All right, so the vision of the tortured artist of his torment, right, held up a transfiguring mirror to itself. And the nature of what that transfiguring vision displayed is an expression of the Greeks, particularly in their case, of course, an expression of their strength, courage, and so on. So for the Greeks, their abundance of life meant that their response to the problem of existence, their overcoming of a potentially lethal despair, had to show them, because of who they were, it had to show them life once again, but life transfigured. For them, life was a richness and an abundance, even as they looked into the abyss, into the horror of existence. If they were to overcome that pessimistic insight, they had to do it according to their nature. If they were to remain in life, they had to see all the positive that they felt in life before them. They had to see life elevated and deified, such that even with their insight into the horror of existence, life overall was felt to be worth living. So Nietzsche says, how else could that people have borne existence, given their extreme sensitivity, their stormy desires, and their unique gift for suffering, if that same existence had not been shown to them in their gods? This is the act of transfiguration. They see into the horror of existence. They're struck by it. The temptation to self-destruction is there. The response is called out of them. And the response for them is artistic. And the artistic response has, because of who they are, has, if they are going to survive life and not merely endure it, but flourish as they wish to, they have to show themselves again transfigured, writ large in their gods. That's what happens. The same drive which calls art into being to complete and perfect existence, and thus seduce us into continuing to live, thereby gave rise to the world of the Olympians. Note that we have to be seduced into living on. The sexual connotation or the sexual ring to that term is, I think, quite intended. We have to in some way be led and enchanted back to life. But because of who the Greeks were, they didn't want to just come back to life in a subsistence way. They wanted to come back to life in a way that was at least capable of showing them again that vivacity that pushed them into the abyss in the first place. Something like that. In fact, Nietzsche goes so far as to say that this Apollonian response for the Greeks is so powerful that it actually, in a sense, reverses Hellenic insight, or at least there's a kind of psychological about face that occurs. He says, under the bright sunshine of such gods, the Apollonian gods, the whole pantheon. Existence is felt to be worth attaining, and the real pain of Homeric man now refers to his departure from this existence. So the real pain ceases to be the fact that you are alive and you're not dead, and it's reversed. It's actually the real pain is that, well, one day we might die. That's one hell of a reversal. The real pain of Homeric man is actually about departure from life, about eventual death, and particularly to imminent departure, so that one might say of them, reversing the wisdom of Silenus, that the very worst thing for them was to die soon, and the second worst thing was ever to die at all. All right. So, I apologize for going quickly, but we need to. So, we have a sense then of a natively powerful, courageous people whose power and courage and curiosity opens up for them the problem of life in a way that risks destroying them. They respond to this creatively, using the Apollonian drive, artistic drive. And in this way, they overcome despair, and not merely to a subsistence level, but to a level that enables them to glory in life in the manner suited to them. Okay, we now must move to our penultimate step. Okay, namely how this Apollonian creation is challenged by its Dionysian counterpart. Because remember, Nietzsche says at the very beginning of The Birth of Tragedy that these two artistic drives are in continual reciprocal motion, and he uses kind of quasi-sexual language. They are kind of coupling and uncoupling, always pulling each other into existence. So it's inevitable that this Apollonian creation has to be challenged at some point by the Dionysian. So the Apollonian culture, this the culture of the Greek pantheon, of Homer and so forth, this is a remarkable victory over pessimism. However, this victory over, note, self-destructive forces, and what is the temptation to suicide but an attempt to radically and most comprehensively unform one's form, right? To dissolve, to decompose what has been composed. Well, that's Dionysian, if I ever heard it. All right. Well, I said last week that those of a psychoanalytic bent have long found in The Birth of Tragedy a kind of cosmic writ large playing of what the psychoanalysts would obviously locate as purely psychic forces of repression and eruption and so forth. Well, I think they have a point. So as we know, the Greeks transfigured their despair artistically, and they did that by imposing Apollonian clarity, order, measure, restraint, and so on. And they did this repeatedly. Nietzsche's thinking of a long span of time that led up to the creation of Apollonian culture. This despair is repeatedly overcome, or at the very least, it's veiled, it's withdrawn. Now, ironically, this leads to, in a sense, a certain shallowing of the culture in terms of its insight into the abyss. I think we have to treat this idea of shallowing carefully. Nietzsche says, of course, that the Greeks were superficial out of profundity. So it's not as if they deny or lose sight of the abyss. but I think there is a certain kind of deprioritization or shifting of emphasis of the insight into the horror of life necessarily over toward the beauty of the Apollonian. That, of course, has to happen in order for the wisdom of Silenus to be overcome at all. But still, Nietzsche says that actually what we have in Homeric or Apollonian culture is an artistically dammed up world built on shine and measure, semblance and measure. So this Apollonian world wouldn't exist if they hadn't had that penetrating insight. But the creation of the transfiguring, seductive, beautiful, glorifying response itself leads to a certain smothering and damming up of the violent energies that have to be suppressed in order for the culture to survive and to flourish. But it's this very damming up that makes the whole culture vulnerable to eruption. Now, this image, does anyone know who this is depicting? Anyone know? No. This is a kind of human analog of that. This is Pentheus. Pentheus ripped to shreds alive by the Maenads, the female companions of Dionysus, who are led by Pentheus's mother. Now, the fact that Nietzsche assumes that when Midas converses with Silenus, he converses with a goat-legged satyr is a clue. It's quite obvious that Silenus is a companion of Dionysus, of this seething frenzy of unformed power. So to look into the depth of existence requires a certain exposure to, awareness of, and proximity to the deepest energies of existence for Nietzsche. And it also shows up, if you like, a certain paleness of life, a certain kind of bloodlessness, if you like, in the glorious, measured, calm Apollonian world. Now, we'll see that when it comes to the tremendous achievement, as Nietzsche understands it, of tragic theatre, that part of that achievement is this balanced coupling of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. But fundamentally important to understand is that this balanced coupling is artistically achieved. That means it is mediated. The Dionysian is not encountered when one, as a spectator, sits in the theatre and watches the tragedy. One does not encounter the Dionysian energies unmediated. One precisely encounters them mediated by the Dionysian artist in the artistic work of art that is tragic theatre. That mediation is fundamentally important. If we do not understand that we meet in the spectacle of that enchanted ground of, as we'll see next week, of the theatre with the satyr chorus and the action and everything that's going on there phenomenologically for Nietzsche in terms of the spectator. We don't understand that the energies and the Dionysian dislocating energies that are experienced by the spectator, if we don't understand that those are mediated and therefore kept at a certain tension and distance, then we don't understand anything properly. Okay, so unmediated, the Dionysian, the Dionysian exists on a spectrum, okay, from, drunkenness and lark to slaughter and death and madness. It's precisely this unmediated form of the Dionysian, particularly its most extreme form, is the barbaric. It's absolutely obviously to be avoided. So the Dionysian is always an illusion. Remember, it's always an illusion. It's always a magic. It's always an enchantment. So we have, minor disruption and a kind of lability of our subjectivity when we have a few glasses of wine, through to the kind of slaughter that we see, for example, in Euripides' Bacchae, of which this picture is a depiction, the dismemberment alive of Pentheus. And if those of you who are not familiar with this moment from the Bacchae, it's extraordinary. It took a lot not to simply just put the whole passage up there and read it through. But remember, this is the Dionysian. You are playing with tremendously volatile, potentially lethal energies. The Dionysian is precisely unform, non-representation, non-comprehensibility, unclarity. It is that which, under its spell, will always see, eventually, if unchecked, form giving way to unformed, even if that unformation is to be ripped alive by one's own mother. Freud coming back in. All right. Now, these columns are Doric style of art. Nietzsche sketches in section 4, toward the end of section 4 of The Birth of Tragedy. He says there's a back and forth movement. We have this creation of Apollonian culture. We have eruptions through, if you like, Dionysian incursions. Then there is a pushback by the culture, a reassertion of order and control, back and forth and back and forth. And for him, the Doric style of architecture can be read as an expression of a culture that is attempting to incorporate and absorb these Dionysian energetics that are disruptive and are reasserting order and control in a very severe way in the Doric. He says the Doric can be read as a permanent military encampment of the Apollonian and a bulwark against the titanic, barbaric nature of the Dionysian. All right. We'll make it. Okay. So, now we have to move to our last section. Now, this section is going to connect us explicitly with what we will pick up next week. Namely, it will enable us to get a grip on the fashioning of the great achievement that is, for Nietzsche, ancient Greek tragic theatre. Okay, so what Nietzsche does is he says, okay, look. He says, we have the insight into the horror, we have the creative response, then the fashioning of the Apollonian culture. and we have the period of eruption of the Dionysian forces, and then the pushback, and then so on and so on. Now, effectively, he says, well, how do we get from that, unless we want to think that Doric architecture is the crown of the ancient Greek world, which he clearly doesn't think, how do we get from that to the emergence of the tragic art form? Well, he says we need to find the germ that grows into the Dionysian dithyramb, which grows into what we know of as the Sophoclean and Aeschylean tragic theatres. Where is that germ? And he says, well, the germ is in the lyric poet, the Dionysian lyric poet. And he says, the first of these figures is Archilochus. So, you need to look to Archilochus, therefore, to understand how and why the Doric is just not the end of the story, if you like, or that the story doesn't play out in some other way and instead develops into this tremendous archetypal creation of Greek tragic theatre. All right, now, Nietzsche points out that there is a pairing in the ancient world between Homer, who he associates with Apollonian artistry, and Archilochus. Now, Archilochus was a remarkable figure. If you're not keen on flowery language, don't read him, but he is fascinating and quite extraordinary. He broke the mold in many ways by, for a start, being a soldier as well as a poet. And we need to get to grips with him, because for him, for Nietzsche, Archilochus is the germ. Now, one of the first things Nietzsche does is he says, okay, some scholarship in his time, some recent scholarship has depicted Homer as an objective style of art, like he is the objective artist, and Archilochus, well, he's a subjective artist. He says I all the time, so on. He speaks in the first person. And Nietzsche dismisses this and says this is a complete misunderstanding. The last thing he says that Archilochus is subjective when he says I. Now, what the hell does that mean? Right? Well, it means something absolutely extraordinary. He says, so Nietzsche says actually objectivity is the key. It's the key to understanding Archilochus. He says the prime demand we make of any kind and level of art is in fact the conquest of subjectivity, the release and redemption from the I, he's still sounding like Schopenhauer, and the falling silence of all individual willing and desiring, sounding like Schopenhauer. But we have to see underneath this. This is something more interesting actually than Schopenhauer. So what he says is actually when we read Archilochus, what we are reading, even when we read lines that begin with I, or that when he refers to himself, we're not reading Archilochus. No. Archilochus, in fact, has bracketed his subjectivity. The mere man, Archilochus, has actually been bracketed. It's kind of become transparent. What does this mean? Well, let's start here. Nietzsche first points not to Archilochus, but to someone much more recent in time, Schiller, who says in a letter, I think, to Goethe, Schiller says, basically, when I come to create poetry, I enter into a musical mood. I don't see images in my mind. I don't see anything like that. I enter a musical mood. And for Nietzsche, this is an important clue. Now, this is going to be dense, and we don't have much time. But let's just see where we go. Okay. Nietzsche says, because bear in mind, he needs to explain the nature of the Dionysian lyric poet. All right. So lyric of lyricism, of the melodic, of the musical in some manner, and poetry, words. So there's a marriage there between a kind of musicality and a discursivity, a kind of writtenness. Okay. Well, straight away we can see there's Dionysianism and Apollonianism, okay, harnessed there. All right. So we have to start by noting that the ancient world saw an identity between the lyric poet and the musician. So, for example, Sappho, if you read the poems of Sappho, these would have been sung. Anyway. So, second, as we see, the lyric poet is under a spell. He has been taken away. He's under Dionysian enchantment. State of song, of dance, of frenzy. There's a dislocated subjectivity there. That's the state. So he is intoxicated, and while he is under the spell of Dionysus, while he is in this state of illusion, he feels that he's become one with the primordial unity. Now remember, this is an illusion. The poet, so Archilochus, the man, is obviously not in fact merged with the Ur-Aina because it would kill him. But he is swarmed, overtaken, colonized by disruptive energies. So the experience for him, the phenomenality, is an enchantment, but if you like, his psychic transformation, his altered energetic state is a real, as Nietzsche calls it, a physiological condition. This excitation of, he obviously doesn't use these terms, and maybe it's misleading, but this kind of excitation of the organism, if you like, then generates something very important. It generates, Nietzsche says, a copy of this primordial unity that the artist thinks himself merged with as music. This would accord for Nietzsche with the musical mood that Schiller speaks of. So you are an intoxicated human being. You move into that state of enchantment. And out of that state of enchantment in which you are swarmed by energies and feel merged with the great ground of awe, you feel within yourself a kind of musicality. This is only the first, or really actually the second stage in Nietzsche's account. Okay. So the sequence is, as I said, you fall under the spell of intoxication. A physiological transformation. The physis, if you like, the living totality is truly affected, even if the phenomenality of being merged with the ground is illusory. You are physiologically transformed, affected. That's the first stage. Second stage, a musical copy of this affectivity is produced within the individual. Note, this is, as Nietzsche says, imageless and conceptless. It has to be because it's Dionysian, it's not Apollonian. It's music, a kind of rhythmicality of the organism, of the original pain felt by the primal ground. So there is a repetition or a kind of transposition into the individual, into the raptured, intoxicated Dionysiac, as a kind of musicality, a rhythmicality within the poet of the unformed and pure non-representativeness of the Dionysian. So the individual is kind of resonating and musically, something like that. Then the crucial third stage, within the poet, this musical affectivity now becomes harnessed by the second primal artistic drive, namely the Apollonian, and that musicality becomes transposed into psychic images. quote, under the influence of Apollonian dream, this music in turn becomes visible to him as symbolic dream images. So, you have a dancing, or at least a raptured individual, resonating with a musical attunement, and then out of that, erupting in kind of crystalline images inside the poet are images. There's this gorgeous transfer or transposition into the Apollonian. And remember, every creation or transfer of unform into form sees the primal ground exalt. So remember, the human being is not the priority. The priority is always the primal ground and its release, its joy. The primal ground will have the human Dionysian lyric artist, the poet, enraptured and entranced, and it will have it shiver and echo inside with a musical attunement, and then it will exalt gorgeously as that erupts into images in the poet's head. And then there is a fourth stage in which those images become words. Thus, as we said before, does the primal ground use the artist for its own joyous release in semblance. So this is the germ of the later achievement of tragic theatre. By the close of our final lecture next week, we'll be to properly appreciate why. So lastly, I want to say a few words about the subjectivity of Archilochus. A few more words. Given that Nietzsche rejected the idea that, as I said, that Archilochus is subjective in any way, even though he says I. Now, in an extraordinary account, this is a further little bit of extraordinariness. So for Nietzsche, Archilochus' subjectivity, so that which we would normally ascribe to him when he says I, me, is nothing at all to do with that usual sense of I. He doesn't name that petty creation called Archilochus, the man. There's a certain history, lives at a certain time, has certain desires. None of that matters. None of that is in play. All of that is bracketed. What is Archilochus when he is raptured and creating? What is Archilochus? What is this Dionysian lyric poet? He is a kind of living, human-shaped openness and channel of transposition to the primal ground. So in this condition of musical transfiguration, musical into imagery transfiguration, right? The images that come to the poet are renderings whose impetus is coming from out of the heart of the world, as Nietzsche said. It's coming from the primal ground. And of course it does, because it's the primal ground who uses the lyric artist as its means of release in semblance, in word. Nietzsche says, the eye of the lyric poet, Archilochus, sounds out from the deepest abyss of being. So when Archilochus says I, there's nothing at all to do with Archilochus the man. It is, and again, this is where Nietzsche kind of elides, or at least allows a bit of Schopenhauerianism to creep in. What actually is saying I is the primal ground, the Eine, the eternal I-ness that which is the only I-ness which truly exists at all. He says, eternal and resting in the ground of things. So this lyric genius of Archilochus is not Archilochus the man at all. He is merely the vehicle, the tool, the occasion. The lyric genius is actually the genius of the world artist, the Einer, which expresses its primal pain symbolically in the likeness of the man Archilochus. And now we are done. Thank you very much.